The last time we left the Fellowship, a sudden reversal had occurred and we lost one of our most beloved characters. I did also slightly touch upon this decision to kill Gandalf and how it is crucial in leaving some space for Aragon to grow as a leader. So we're going to wrap up the last act of the Fellowship, analyzing the remaining plot devices that make this film the best out of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Hi, I'm Ohms and welcome to OmzLaw. If you're new to the series, please make sure to check out the previous videos before watching this one. It's a pretty long series. The death of Gandalf leads Aragon to assume some leadership, telling Gimli, Boromir and Legolas to get the hobbits on their feet so that they reach the woods of Lothlorien, barely leaving any time for anyone to mourn. So they reach the woods, and this is one of those rare moments whereby I feel that the theatrical edition had the better cut, whereas the extended edition takes the Lothlorian Sequence and stretches the hell out of it. The Fellowship is forbidden to enter, Aragon tries to convince them otherwise, Frodo feels that everyone hates him due to Gandalf's death, Boromir tries to make him feel better, and actually we could have had a more interesting scene here with Boromir by developing his relationship with Frodo more. Maybe attempting to get closer to him so that the later scenes have stronger payoff, but instead we barely get a minute of Boromir telling Frodo to not carry the weight of the dead. And the elves agree to let them pass, and the sequence goes on. In the theatrical cut, we are immediately taken to Cate Blanchett, and this whole sequence is basically not there. Sure, it does establish the vastness of Galadriel's home, but it really drags the plot down. The set pieces are without a doubt the most impressive mixture of miniatures, set construction, and CGI, and the entrance of Galadriel and the introduction of the space therein is truly mesmerizing and captivating. But nothing really happens here except basic exposition. Galadriel finds out about Gandalf's death, the Fellowship is basically scolded and warned that they might fail on the quest, information which we honestly did not need to be told, as we already assumed this by this point. And well, nothing else happens. Galadriel reveals her psychic powers to us, and then this weird interaction with Frodo happens, which still feels incredibly out of character for her, even after watching these films multiple times. I get that this is here to show us what the Ring of Power can do to Galadriel, but we also see in The Hobbit that she has this evil side to her. We're also introduced in the next sequence that if she gets close to the ring, she turns into this monstrosity thing. This is a Peter Jackson edition, and it's one of my least favorites, to be honest. I remember when I first saw the scene whereby Galadriel shows him the scouring of the Shire and warns him that if he should fail, his home would be gone. I was completely shocked with Galadriel's transformation when offered the ring by Frodo. In a sense, we do need this scene in order to establish what would happen if the ring was used by an elf or a wizard. However, I think it's slightly overdone and hasn't aged really well in relation to the rest of the film, disregarding the masking mess we saw earlier. And if we are critiquing the plot in accordance to the three-act structure, this entire sequence is unneeded for several reasons. 1. We are introduced to Galadriel officially for the first time from the eyes of Frodo and the Fellowship. We're also introduced to this other character that comes back for an appearance in the Two Towers, but his time on screen is negligible. 2. We're introduced to a new location, and we spent a lot of time here to say the least. There's a lament to Gandalf, Sam tries to say a few words, adding some light humor. There's some bonding between Aragon and Boromir concerning the fall of Gondor, which honestly is somewhat welcomed since these men rarely interact with one another, but again, this moment is wasted as it does not develop Aragon. Instead, it's just a basic exposition about Minas Tirith and the foreshadowing of Aragon becoming king, which honestly by this point, this needs to stop. There's also the encounter between Galadriel and Frodo, and this makes this whole thing really stretch out. And what's worse about this is that it doesn't really add anything to the overall story. Sure, the Fellowship receives some gifts that help them out later, but we could have given these props in Rivendell. And yes, Galadriel does become the symbol of hope for Frodo, but that role could have been given to Gandalf, as it was in some moments, or even Aragon. By the time the Fellowship have their gifts, sure, we have a couple of nice moments here with Cate Blanchett, and have departed once more on their quest. Over 20 minutes of runtime has passed. This really stretches out the third act, and in a sense turns the entire film into a 4 or 5 act structure, depending on how you divide the plot points. And this is where I feel the Fellowship stopped economizing on its scenes. However, this isn't really the case in the theatrical cut. We then have these lengthy river shots that stretch out the act even more, and are now acting more like an advertisement for New Zealand rather than shots that are contributing to the story. The Uruk-hai finally come back into the plot, and the pace slightly picks up and then drops back down again, with Gollum making another appearance, Sam caring for Frodo, Frodo acting all weird and refusing Sam's help. This entire night scene is not in the theatrical, including Boromir's confrontation with Aragon, which is slightly overdone, and their bickering in the end is also slightly forced, with Aragon again not really having any character development besides telling Boromir that he's not gonna take the ring to Gondor. And suddenly, in the next scene, he's very proud to look upon the kings of old, and he calls them his kin. So, you can see here that the pace is all over the place, and it really stays that way until the encounter between Frodo and Boromir. Sure, Aragon is a Númenórean, which is basically this different race that had longer lives and could heal people, but this information doesn't come up until the second film, and we do have very impressive miniatures here. But the Fellowship ends up camping on the shore, with Legolas insisting that they leave, and the runtime stretches out even more. Conflict finally starts driving the plot forward, with Boromir being seduced by the ring and asking Frodo for it. Frodo escapes by putting it on, which I still don't get why, but okay, maybe this one is forgivable in relation to the others, and Boromir snaps out of it. Frodo confronts my worst nightmare again, trips, and suffers no concussion from that fall. I mean, he fell from that height. Aragon finds him, Frodo is freaked out, he gets slightly tempted by the ring, and basically the two agree that Frodo needs to continue the journey on his own. The Uruk-hai arrive, and the plot finally accelerates once more. The Fellowship presents this epic sequence, beautifully choreographed and shot, with all the characters acting and contributing to the sequence. Merry and Pippin distract them, Legolas and Gimli take out the enemies together, Boromir arrives in order to complete his redemption arc, and basically ends up dying to save the hobbits, who end up getting captured anyways. He has a beautiful moment with Aragon, acknowledging him as his king. This is why Aragon should have had more development with Boromir, and should have been maybe learning from him as a leader, or making mistakes that Boromir can correct him on. A lot of missed opportunity here, to be honest. But it's nice to see Aragon acknowledging that he needs to protect their people, and the climax of the Fellowship of the Ring is finally reached. We enter a bittersweet resolution, whereby Frodo stands awkwardly on the shore, remembering Gandalf's words back in Moria, until he decides to leave. Sam comes in to join him, and we have this weird drowning scene that's supposed to introduce some conflict, but is completely unnecessary. The remaining Fellowship try to follow them, but Aragon proposes they go after Merry and Pippin. Boromir is thrown down a waterfall, and Frodo and Sam look upon Mordor, and the film finally ends. I honestly never thought we'd make it till the end of this plot, and I definitely feel that everything prior to Gandalf's death is much more solid and flows in a much more efficient manner than the remaining part of the film. Despite there being an epic battle near the end, the climax felt underwhelming in relation to what happens in Moria. The Two Towers remedies this with the climax in Helm's Deep and Isengard, but Return of the King suffers from this as well in the final battle, which felt underwhelming in relation to the Battle of Minas Tirith. I think by moving the Galadriel scene to Rivendell, I know this violates a lot of the rules of the world, but since this is an adaptation, these things could have been worked around by the filmmakers, and they could have still been faithful to the source material. And by having the hobbits get the props before they leave Rivendell, we free up the third act to deal with the ramifications of Gandalf's death, highlighting Aragon as a leader, giving him something to do, elaborating on Boromir's relationship with him instead of wasting time exposing a whole new place with a whole new set of characters, also maybe working on Frodo and Boromir's relationship along with Frodo and Aragon's, then immediately cut to the Uruk-hai arriving. I would even start working on some of this stuff before, which they tried to do with Aragon and Boromir with Frodo, but again, it feels a bit rushed and forced sometimes. The Two Towers and Return of the King suffer from this type of stretching the plot as well, but before we move on to those films and perhaps start a new series whereby we recreate some of the scenes inside of Lord of the Rings, we'll wrap up in the next video how Fellowship re-envisioned and reimagined the medieval fantasy genre, and how it will forever stand out as one of the best films ever made. And I'll see you guys next time with more Lord of the Rings content. Don't forget to comment and like this video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss any future uploads. And as always, thank you for watching.